It seems like this presidential election season has already been going on for 3 years. But no, it ain't over yet. You still have more than 5 months until Election Day. You got to get through the conventions this summer. But the primaries are at least coming to an end soon. And it's the primaries that have been at the heart of a controversy in this country that unlike any I've seen before. And a lot of it is probably because of Donald Trump on the Republican side, who, by the way, is already over the top. He has enough delegates pledged to him that there will not be a contested convention, to the dismay, by the way, of every single political pundit in this country who was telling you that when they got to Cleveland, there was going to be a contested convention, and they were all excited in the media about covering that. And I said in January, ain't going to happen. And in fact, it isn't. He has enough votes, and there will not be anybody else but Donald Trump as the GOP nominee for president. And of course, on the Democrat side, you've got Bernie Sanders, who is still out there fighting, even though mathematically he can't catch up with Hillary Clinton, but he's vowed to continue battling it out until June 7th, when California and a bunch of other states have their say. But there are lots of people in this country who were not happy about the fact that those primaries took place without allowing non-members of those parties to vote in them. And one of them is my next guest. His name is John Opdycke. He is the president of a group called Open Primaries USA. And he joins me now here on the Big 550. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm great, Paul. How are you?
Good. There was a story this week in the New York Times that the GOP is, quote, mulling an overhaul of their primaries because they were not happy with how things went this year. When you hear that sort of thing, does that make you feel better about what may change going forward?
Well, yes and no. I think that I certainly don't trust the political parties to do what's right for the American people. I think there's a fierce debate and fight taking place within both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party about whether to remake their rules to be either more constrictive, less open, or more democratic and more open. But I frankly think the more important conversation is taking place outside the parties. The American people, 43% of Americans now identify as independent, as no party. It's the largest group of voters in the country. And more people are beginning to recognize that how the process is set up is really important. So that conversation is not simply taking place inside the parties, it's taking place outside the parties. And
so you want the parties to agree to open up their primaries so anybody can vote in them?
Well, I want two things. And first is that when it comes to presidential primaries, that there should be one standard, that every American citizen who's a registered voter, whether they're a registered Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Green Party, what have you, that they should have the right to participate as they see fit in those presidential primaries, regardless of what state they live in. Those primaries are funded by the public. They're taxpayer funded, and every voter should have the right to participate in them. At the state and federal level, for offices like Congress, state Senate, and state Assembly, and so forth, what we're pushing for is called the public primary. And we have this in place in California, Nebraska, and Washington. What that means is instead of having a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, you have a public primary. You have one primary. All the candidates appear on the ballot. All the voters get the same ballot and get to choose from among all the candidates, and the top two vote getters go on to the general election. The big advantage of a public primary is that all voters are included. Everyone gets, to participate, and you send people to Washington and to state capitals. You elect people that have had to go through a process of facing all the voters. Too often, members of legislatures and Congress, they get elected by only having to speak to members of their own party. Mm-hmm. And that makes them ineffective lawmakers and certainly biased lawmakers.
You think it creates more pandering?
Absolutely. I mean, put yourself in a situation, Paul, where you got elected to, the state house. having run in a closed partisan primary, let's hypothetically say you're a Republican, and you have to only talk to Republican Party activists to win the Republican primary, and then in the general election you either run unopposed, which is the case in almost 50% of the races in this country. It's a dirty little secret of American politics. Or you run against a token Democrat. Well, why would you go to the State House and do anything other than pander to that small group of Republican activists in your district? They're the only people that count to you. They're the only votes that matter. So absolutely, closed systems, partisan systems, they create all kinds of pandering on the left and the right.
Of course, you know what the parties say to this, John, and that is, look, we're not closed. If you want to vote in the Democratic Party primary, go ahead and register as a Democrat, and you're allowed to vote. Republicans, same thing. Libertarians, you can vote in your primary. Green Party, you can vote in your primary. Just choose one and you can vote. We're not keeping you out.
Well, last time I read the United States Constitution, it didn't say anything about political parties. It didn't say that you have to join a political party in order to exercise your First Amendment right to vote and participate. And frankly, your argument would make more sense 50 years ago when 92% of Americans bought into the party system. They understood that, as you're saying, choosing a team, choosing a side, that made good sense. And I could even argue that was true. It's not true today. People see the parties for what they are, which is self-interested private associations that have usurped the rights of the voters to control the system. They control it themselves, and it puts millions, tens of millions of Americans at a disadvantage, including people who want to join a party. Because think about this. You might want to join a party. Say you want to be a Democrat. Does that mean you only get to choose Democratic candidates? Why should you be limited? Why shouldn't you be able to vote for the people you think are going to do the best job? They might be a Republican or a Green or a Libertarian.
Okay, but let me continue making the argument on behalf of the parties. And by the way, I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think our whole primary system has to be completely overhauled in many, many ways. I like the idea of a public primary where, the top two go on later on. But the Republicans would say, look, we don't like the fact that in some states, independents were allowed to vote. We think that in some states that may have influenced things in a way that we don't like. This is, of course, the Republican Party, the mainstream members of the Republican Party, not the Donald Trump wing, but the mainstream members who feel like they've had their party torn asunder by allowing non-Republicans to vote in Republican primaries, especially the ones who are more conservative. They want to keep out anybody who's not like them. It's their party. Can't they set their own rules?
Well, that argument might hold water if these weren't taxpayer-funded elections. See, that's the way the parties have it structured. They claim, hey, we're a private association. We're like the Rotary Club or the Knights of Columbus or the ACLU or the NRA. We're a private group of citizens. Of course, we should be able to determine who can and who can't participate in our internal party business.
Yep.
That argument makes sense for the Rotary Club. It doesn't make sense for the parties because they get the taxpayers to put up $500 million to conduct those primaries. They get the government to conduct them, to put their, the election day workers out there manning the machines and the voting booths. It's a public function, and the American people, they don't relate to the primary process, particularly at the presidential level, as an internal party selection process. They relate to it as this is the first stage of selecting who the president of the United States is going to be. So the parties can't have it both ways. They can't say, we're a private association, leave us alone, but by the way, give us all your money to fund our internal party business. Can't do both things.
Okay, so how are you going to change it? You got to sue them, don't you?
Well, we're pursuing a lot of different avenues. We're definitely pursuing legal remedies, directly going after the taxpayer funding issue. Mm-hmm. We are putting referendums on the ballot in South Dakota this year to enact a public primary. We are pursuing legislative opportunities in Michigan, in Nebraska, and some other states. And we're building a national movement of citizens who recognize that this kind of process issue, we can't ignore it anymore. How the process is set up directly affects not just who wins, but the kind of governing that goes on in the country. And I could make a case, and I do make the case, that the kind of toxic gridlock and partisanship that has only, gives Congress an 88% disapproval rating is directly connected to how those members of Congress get elected.
Yeah. As I say, I think it needs to be overhauled completely. I think we've got an incredibly corrupt system, from the way the primaries are run to the whole idea of caucuses, which are just idiotic, to gerrymandering, to all the rest of this, to having elections on weekdays when people are working, to having multiple elections in the course of a year when everybody only thinks of election days being in November. It's just, it needs a top-to-bottom overhaul. Unfortunately, you're talking about trying to convince the people who are in charge to give up some of their own power. And as you know, they don't like to do that, John.
That's true, and that's why we're particularly focused on states that have the initiative in the referendum, because you're right. State legislatures are very disinterested in enacting laws that would dramatically increase competition for their seats.
Yeah.
So the referendum process is very, very important.
If you want to find out,
say a word.
Go ahead.
About what you're saying about the need for a total overhaul.
Yeah.
I agree completely with you that from top to bottom, the American political system is a combination of outdated, broken, and in need of an overhaul. The thing that, in my opinion, is so important about open primaries is that what it does is it positions the American people as having more power and more options, because I think the way we're going to get the best overhaul of the system is if the American people are driving that conversation and that process. If we leave it up to the pundits and the insiders and the experts and the parties to do that overhaul, we're going to get more of the same. It won't be a real overhaul.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as I say, you only get power away from powerful people with a crowbar, and that's what you're going to need. It's going to take some judge somewhere to maybe even the Supreme Court to have the last say on this. But in the meantime, if you want to learn more about what John is talking about and his cause here, you can go to the website openprimaries.org and find out more. John Opdycke is the president of Open Primaries, and I appreciate your time today.
Yes, and when you go to that website, sign our petition. We're working to get 1 million signatures to deliver to the Democratic and Republican national committees at their conventions, saying the people want a 50-state open primary for president in 2020.
All right, John, thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul.
I'm Paul Harris. This is the Big 550 KTRS.